Hey guys! Tonight we begin with some medieval stories, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine a queen ruling not with the booming authority of a Julius Caesar, but with the subtlety of a librarian who also occasionally poisons the library cat for fun, or maybe just because she can. That was often the case for women in power back then. They had to be clever, adaptable, and willing to live with a little historical neglect. So let's ease into the story of one such ruler. Our first stop is Sobek-Neferu, one of the very few female pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Sobek-Neferu ruled for 4 years, somewhere around 1800 BC. You may have heard of Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra, with the dramatic eyeliner and the ability to charm Romans out of their sandals. But Sobek-Neferu, not so much. She's more of a footnote, which is perfect for tonight's slow, drifting exploration. Sobek-Neferu wasn't exactly planning to be a ruler. She was born into the 12th dynasty, a family with a slightly overachieving streak. Her father, Amenemhat III, had been king for decades, and she had a brother who, well, he died, because life was fun that way back then. So, of course, she stepped up. And while modern stories often romanticize female leaders, Sobek-Neferu's reign was probably mostly paperwork and palace intrigues, punctuated by the occasional religious ritual. Ancient Egypt loved their crocodile gods, and Sobek-Neferu herself even took a name invoking Sobek, the crocodile deity, probably to make herself sound more formidable, which, if you think about it, is kind of adorable. Imagine introducing yourself at parties as Sobek-Neferu, Crocodile Queen, and hoping no one laughs too loudly. Interestingly, she seemed to embrace some of the masculine imagery that came with kingship. Statues of her show her in the traditional pharaoh's beard, which was mostly symbolic, because nothing says, "I'm in charge," like a fake beard glued to your chin. It was subtle messaging, reminding her subjects, "I'm queen, but I can also be king if necessary." She had to navigate the tricky waters of ruling in a system that didn't entirely trust women, all while probably wondering why crocodiles were such a big deal. Let's float over to another forgotten female empire later in time, and much farther east, Queen Tamaris of the Massageti. Now, the Massageti were a nomadic people living in what is now Central Asia, around the 6th century BC, and Tamaris, she had a bit of a reputation. Historians tell us she ruled a confederation of tribes, a role that usually requires a fair bit of horseback riding, spear handling, and general world weariness. Tamaris is mostly remembered for her encounter with Cyrus the Great of Persia. Yes, the same Cyrus who conquered everyone in sight. Because why not? She supposedly defeated him in battle, and there are stories likely embellished of her putting him in a wine barrel, or decapitating him, or at least strongly suggesting that he reconsider his life choices. Of course, she was called a queen, but really, she was more like a CEO of a multinational nomadic company, dealing with logistics, alliances, and the occasional intertribal dispute. And sadly, that part of history is mostly forgotten, overshadowed by the Persian Empire's eventual expansion. What's charming about Tamaris is the little human touches, her decisiveness, her refusal to be sidelined, and perhaps most importantly, the sense that she had no patience for drama that wasn't directly relevant to survival. That's a vibe you can respect while slowly drifting off, imagining camels plodding across the steppe and campfires flickering under endless stars. Next, let's wander into medieval Africa, to the kingdom of Ndongo and Matamba, where a woman named Queen Nzinga ruled in the 17th century. Nzinga's story is like a long, drawn-out chess game, except the pieces are real people, and also cannons, sometimes. Born in 1583, she was a diplomat, warrior, and occasional general negotiator of treaties with Portuguese colonizers. Life was complicated. Her brother was king, she was heir apparent, and also apparently really good at looking imposing in regal attire. Nzinga's cleverness wasn't just about brute force. She staged dramatic protests. There's a famous story where she arrived at a Portuguese negotiation meeting seated on a servant, having refused to sit on the ground. She wanted to assert her authority without appearing hostile, and it worked. Mostly, she spent decades resisting colonial pressure, engaging in proxy battles, and occasionally indulging in elaborate political theater that today we would call big mood. What's remarkable, and slightly sleep-inducing in its repetitiveness, is how she managed statecraft over decades. It's mostly small victories, minor treaties, and strategic alliances, punctuated by personal sacrifices, courtly intrigues, and endless paperwork disguised as diplomacy, which, to be honest, makes her life sound a lot like anyone's Monday morning, except with more swords and fewer coffee breaks. Floating gently westward now, let's drift into Europe, to a time when female rulership was sporadically tolerated, but never fully normalized. Consider Empress Matilda, also known as Maud, from the 12th century. Matilda was a contender for the English throne during a period known as the Anarchy, which is, as the name suggests, a series of long, tedious conflicts over succession. She was married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, briefly an empress, and then returned to England to claim her birthright. Her life was bureaucratically exhausting. Wars, sieges, and endless letters. There were battles, but mostly she spent her time negotiating, cajoling, and occasionally having tantrums that historians gently describe as assertive. Matilda had one son, Henry II, who eventually became king. Ironically, her hard work, stress, and political savvy are mostly overshadowed by the fact that she never got crowned queen, because medieval England was apparently allergic to strong women wearing crowns. But still, she quietly reshaped English history, while historians largely ignored her. What's charmingly ironic here is how Matilda, despite all her struggles, might be best described as the woman who did everything right, and still had to wait for her son to inherit the throne before people noticed. It's a very slow, existential kind of frustration, perfect for bedtime reflection. And now, it float eastward again, to Southeast Asia, where a woman named Queen Regnant Tribhuwana Wijayatunggadwai ruled the Majapahit Empire in Java during the 14th century. Majapahit was one of the last major Hindu-Buddhist empires in the region, and Tribhuwana came to power after her father's death. Like many royal women, she had to balance ceremonial duties, religious obligations, and the delicate politics of a court filled with ambitious men who had opinions about women running the country. Her reign was functional. She maintained stability, oversaw administrative reforms, and kept the empire intact during a period that might otherwise have fallen apart. There's little dramatic flair here, mostly meetings, decrees, temple constructions, and the occasional minor rebellion, but it's the quiet endurance of her rule that is compelling. Tribhuwana wasn't celebrated in popular history because she didn't engage in grand battles or scandalous intrigues. She just managed to keep everything from falling apart, and in the grand monotone scheme of things, that's admirable. Finally, it's drift back to Africa, this time to Ya Asantua, a queen mother in the Ashanti Empire of present-day Ghana. Born in the 19th century, she famously led her people during the War of the Golden Stool against British colonizers. Now, unlike the previous rulers we've discussed, Ya Asantua's story includes moments of real-life strategic drama planning, military campaigns, rallying warriors, and standing firm against colonial forces. But if you remove the intensity, her life is mostly long walks through the royal palace, ceremonial duties, endless council meetings, and quietly trying to keep her kingdom together. What makes Ya Asantua's story both tragic and mildly hypnotic is that after the war, she was exiled by the British, and then gradually faded from memory in the broader historical narrative. Yet, in the quiet, the people she led remembered her. And maybe that's the point. A ruler's legacy isn't always in textbooks. Sometimes it's in the slow heartbeat of a culture that survives despite invasions, colonization, and historical neglect. So, as you drift slowly through the stories of Sobek Nefru, Tamaris, Nizingam, Hilda, Tribhuwana, and Ya Asantua, notice the common thread. These women weren't famous for being flashy or overly dramatic. They didn't always conquer continents, or write their names in golden letters across the sky. Mostly, they managed chaos, endured endless paperwork or palace intrigue, and quietly shaped history. And history, as we know, didn't always care. It's oddly soothing to think about, because while the kings fought their epic wars, and history glorified battles and conquest, these women often handled the slow, grinding reality of governance, day after day, decision after decision, and somehow civilizations endured. And you can imagine them, in their quiet chambers, perhaps sighing, checking their scrolls, and muttering under their breath about some overly ambitious general, or a slightly ridiculous treaty, just like anyone on a long Tuesday might do. Alright, let's keep our lights dim and stay cozy. Maybe you're reclining in a chair, or lying on a bed, letting the world fade a little. We're continuing our slow float through the lives of female rulers whose stories didn't make the headlines, or more accurately, whose stories were quietly nudged to the margins of history. Because, of course, history loves to focus on the loud, explosive men. But we're going to savor the quieter, slower kind of power tonight. The kind that comes from patience, endurance, and occasionally dealing with people who don't take you seriously just because you have breasts. Let's begin in China with Wu Zetian, probably the most famous, forgotten female emperor, though not quite as erased as some of our other subjects. She ruled during the Tang dynasty in the 7th century. Wu Zetian wasn't subtle about her ambition. She started as a concubine, climbed her way through court intrigues, and eventually declared herself emperor. The thing about Wu Zetian is that she had to navigate centuries of Confucian tradition, telling everyone that women shouldn't run anything bigger than a small vegetable garden, let alone an entire empire. Her rule, which lasted decades, was a combination of bureaucratic efficiency, ruthless political maneuvering, and subtle propaganda. She commissioned poems praising her wisdom, minted coins in her own name, and cultivated an image of divine authority. And yet, even with all that, some historians describe her as devious or power-hungry, which, let's be honest, is mostly because she succeeded at a job everyone else thought was impossible for a woman. That's the slow irony of Wu Zetian. She ran an empire effectively, and history grudgingly noticed. But she also gets a reputation for scheming, because, apparently, competence in heels is suspicious. Wu Zetian's life also included plenty of mundane details, perfect for bedtime reflection, endless meetings with ministers, tedious court rituals, and, occasionally, examining candidates for government positions. Imagine flipping through piles of paperwork, deciding who deserves a promotion, while also subtly reminding everyone that you literally made the rules now. It's almost soothing to imagine the quiet weight of authority, day after day, punctuated by scrolls and ink stains, not constant battles. Drifting further west, to Eastern Europe, let's visit Olga of Kiev, a 10th century regent of Kievan Rus. Olga's story is patient and slightly melancholy, with tiny moments of sharp wit. She became regent for her young son after her husband's death, which means she spent decades running a fledgling medieval state. Her reputation mostly comes from later chroniclers, who emphasize her cleverness in dealing with enemies, including the occasional local chieftain or rebellious noble. She was also involved in early Christianization efforts in the region, long before her son officially converted. This meant she had to negotiate religious matters, local politics, and familial obligations all at the same time, which, if you think about it, is kind of relatable. Managing multiple priorities while everyone expects you to smile and nod. Her life wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Olga quietly shaped Kievan Rus, planting seeds for future rulers, and then slowly faded into the background, leaving the empire to her descendants. The kind of subtle historical influence that feels like a gentle lullaby, quietly effective, mostly unnoticed. Now, let's drift to Mesoamerica, where women occasionally ruled in city-states like Maya kingdoms. One example is Lady Six Sky, who arrived from a distant city to rule. Naranjo around 682 CE. Lady Six Sky wasn't just a ceremonial figurehead. She actively governed, organized rituals, and oversaw military campaigns. Imagine navigating complex calendars, organizing agricultural festivals, and occasionally telling generals what to do, all in the context of a civilization obsessed with astronomy and ritual precision. Lady Six Sky's reign was long, stable, and, if you remove the occasional battles, pleasantly routine. She might have spent mornings checking temple constructions, afternoons, adjusting the calendar, and evenings, sipping something mildly ceremonial while reflecting on the day's work. Very little in her life was explosive or dramatic, yet her rule left a lasting imprint on her city. And then, over the centuries, her story receded into obscurity because, well, the male rulers got the limelight. But for us tonight, drifting along with her quiet administrative genius is oddly soothing. Floating across the Indian Ocean, let's visit Rani Durgavati, who ruled in central India during the 16th century. Durgavati's story is slightly more lively, but mostly in the slow, bureaucratic sense. She became regent for her young son after her husband's death, and then spent decades managing her kingdom, negotiating with neighboring states, and maintaining relative peace. Her life involved a lot of ceremonial duties, which included religious observances, palace administration, and occasionally hosting visiting dignitaries who might have overstayed their welcome. She was also responsible for training her son in governance and diplomacy, which was a slow, repetitive process, but crucial for the continuity of her kingdom. And while she's remembered today for resisting the Mughals, most of her daily life was, well, paperwork and courtly routines. The long hours of governance, punctuated by minor crises and ceremonial obligations, make her life oddly meditative to think about as you drift off tonight. Now, gently floating northward, let's linger with Margaret I of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, who ruled in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Margaret's story is long, slightly repetitive, and almost hypnotically administrative. She managed to unite 3 Scandinavian kingdoms under one crown, mostly by negotiating marriages, treaties, and succession laws. No dramatic battles, no explosive betrayals, mostly long meetings, letters, and ceremonial duties. Margaret had a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of patience. She was known to wait for the perfect moment to act politically, which often meant years of quiet maneuvering. Imagine decades of slow, calculated decisions, treaties signed, alliances maintained, rebellions quietly suppressed, not with swords, but with paperwork and correspondence. It's the kind of slow-moving historical power that doesn't make headlines, but quietly shapes nations. Almost like watching clouds drift over a calm fjord, unassuming but monumental. Gliding across the Middle East, let's linger for a moment with Shajar el-Dur of Egypt, who ruled briefly in the 13th century. Her story is a little more tragic, but still fits the pattern of quiet endurance. She was initially the wife of a sultan, then became sultan herself after her husband's death. The court politics were complex, and the pressures intense, but much of her life was spent managing palace affairs, negotiating with officials, and trying to maintain stability during a tumultuous period. Shajar el-Durr had to assert herself in a culture that was deeply suspicious of women wielding political authority. She ruled with a combination of patience, intelligence, and occasional decisiveness. Most of her decisions were pragmatic: alliances, governance, and ceremonial duties. And while her reign ended abruptly, the daily life she led, meetings, decrees, and palace routines, is fascinating in its quiet, almost hypnotic rhythm. Finally, let's drift towards South America again, where the Inca Empire occasionally had female leaders in religious and administrative roles. One notable example is Mama Huaco, who, according to legend, was a princess and military leader in pre-Columbian Peru. Her life involved leading small military campaigns, overseeing settlements, and managing ceremonial duties. Much like the other women we've discussed, Mama Huaco's story is mostly about endurance and subtle influence. Long days spent organizing resources, ensuring food production, mediating disputes, and participating in religious ceremonies. The dramatic battles are often exaggerated in oral histories, but the real story is slower, quieter, and involves continuous attention to the rhythms of daily governance. It's repetitive, slightly monotonous, and oddly comforting to imagine, like the gentle ticking of a clock, marking centuries of careful leadership. So, as we drift slowly through these histories from Wu Zetian to Olga of Kiev, Lady Six, Sky, Rani Durgavati, Margaret I, Shajar el-Durr, and Mama Huaco, you'll notice a pattern. These women, often forgotten by mainstream history, spent their lives quietly shaping the world around them, not through flashy battles or dramatic betrayals, but through endurance, subtlety, and relentless attention to detail. Their influence was real, their power genuine, yet the historical record mostly moved on, preferring to glorify the loud, explosive, and obviously violent kings. There's something soothing about this realization. These women ruled empires, oversaw kingdoms, and managed dynasties in the slowest, most meticulous way imaginable. It's almost meditative to picture them sitting in dimly lit chambers, examining scrolls, issuing decrees, and quietly correcting the world, one small, deliberate action at a time. And as you settle further into your chair or pillow, let your mind drift along these slow currents of history. Imagine the quiet palace corridors, the rustle of robes, the faint ink stains on parchment, and the subtle, almost imperceptible influence of women who ruled without the fanfare, but with lasting effect. Alright, let's keep the lights dim and let your mind wander along the soft corridors of history. We're continuing our gentle glide through the lives of women who ruled empires, kingdoms, and small territories, often without the fanfare or recognition we're used to. Their stories are long, slightly repetitive, and perfectly suited for this slow, almost hypnotic narrative. Let's begin with Amanirenas, a queen of the kingdom of Kush in what is now Sudan. Around the 1st century BC, Amanirenas is remembered in passing for resisting Roman expansion, but much like our other rulers, most of her life was quiet and administrative. Picture her walking through palaces, inspecting crops, overseeing local leaders, and occasionally having to deal with an ambitious general who thought she might be easy to intimidate. Spoiler, she wasn't. Amanirenas' life reminds us that being a queen often involves very ordinary, repetitive tasks: budgeting resources, maintaining roads, organizing ceremonies, and managing diplomacy. Yet, the occasional small victory, like sending a Roman envoy packing, punctuated the monotony of daily governance. It's a story that's strangely calming, imagining her calmly handling state affairs while everyone around her worried about swords and armies. Floating eastward, we encounter Hatshepsut, one of the more famous, but still underappreciated female pharaohs of Egypt. She ruled in the 15th century BC and spent decades consolidating power, building temples, and establishing trade networks. Hatshepsut wasn't interested in flashy battles. She preferred stability, efficiency, and a well-ordered state. Her life was full of slow, almost hypnotic routines, inspecting construction projects, signing decrees, hosting religious ceremonies, and occasionally commissioning obelisks that would outlast her reign. There's a gentle irony in her legacy. She had one of the longest and most prosperous reigns in Egyptian history. Yet later, pharaohs tried to erase her from monuments, probably because nothing says historical grudges like posthumous defacement. Imagine living a lifetime of quiet accomplishment, only to have some future ruler smear your name off a wall. It's tragic, but also strangely comforting if you like slow, reflective stories. Next, let's drift to Queen Tuta of Illyria. Around the 3rd century BC, Tuta ruled a small Balkan kingdom and had to navigate tricky waters with the Romans. Most of her life was administrative, managing coastal towns, negotiating with local chiefs, and occasionally defending her realm against pirates or political rivals. There are brief mentions of her engaging in military campaigns, but mostly her life was composed of careful strategy, slow planning, and navigating endless councils. Imagine spending days drafting letters, mediating disputes, and managing resources. Tuta wasn't flashy, she was functional, competent, and quietly effective. And that's the recurring theme of tonight's story. These women ruled empires without the constant, dramatic fireworks that history usually remembers. Their influence is subtle, pervasive, and ultimately enduring. Floating south to Sikh kingdoms in India, we find Rani Kannamma of Kittur, who ruled in the early 19th century. Like many of our subjects, her life was punctuated by duty, ceremony, and small-scale political maneuvering. She inherited leadership after her husband's death and spent years overseeing her kingdom, maintaining stability, and negotiating with neighbors. Kannamma's life included routine inspections of agricultural lands, ceremonial festivals, and minor disputes among local officials. Occasionally, she had to step into the spotlight to assert her authority, but mostly her reign was consistent, reliable, and administratively efficient. There's a meditative quality to imagining these repeated, deliberate actions, the slow rhythm of governance that ensures a kingdom doesn't collapse in a week. Now, let's drift to Africa again, to the Amazons of Dahomey, specifically, the leadership roles women held in the 18th and 19th centuries. The so-called Amazons weren't all battlefield drama and exotic legend. Much of their daily lives involved careful planning, training, maintaining discipline, and coordinating with male rulers. These women were competent, organized, and quietly formidable, often supervising the empire's administrative and ceremonial functions. Imagine long, unbroken days of inspections, drills, palace meetings, and endless paperwork, punctuated only by occasional political skirmishes. Their lives weren't about glory or fame, they were about structure, stability, and endurance. And yet, as always, history remembers the loud kings and dismisses the quiet queens. Next, gently floating toward Japan, we encounter Empress Suko, who ruled in the 7th century. She oversaw the early stages of Japan's centralized government and implemented the 17-article constitution. Suko's reign was slow-moving, with long periods of ceremonial observation, bureaucratic adjustments, and the occasional diplomatic negotiation with neighboring states. Her days probably involved reading reports, signing decrees, meeting with ministers, and subtly asserting authority in a male-dominated court. It's a slow, steady rhythm of governance, more ink stains than sword fights, more scrolls than sieges. And like many of our subjects, her accomplishments were later overshadowed by the male rulers who followed. But for our purposes, tonight, the quiet, Methodical life of Empress Suko is a gentle, hypnotic story. Drifting to Southeast Asia, there's Queen Vijayabai of Bonsal, who ruled a small Maratha principality in the 17th century. Vijayabai spent her reign negotiating alliances, mediating local disputes, and managing day-to-day governance. There are brief mentions of conflicts and rebellions, but mostly her life involved routine administration, ceremonial duties, and overseeing palace life. Imagine the quiet weight of responsibility, the repetitive tasks, the long days of decision-making, punctuated only by occasional court intrigue. Vijayabai's life wasn't glamorous or dramatic. It was a continuous, slow effort to maintain stability and order, a type of power that is strangely soothing to consider. As you relax tonight, floating across the Indian Ocean again, let's linger with Queen Amenitor of Nubia. Around the 1st century CE, Amenitor co-ruled Meroe with her husband, but her influence was substantial. She oversaw temple constructions, religious rituals, and the day-to-day administration of her kingdom. Her reign was a mix of ceremonial obligations, bureaucratic management, and quiet oversight. Picture her walking through the palace, checking on grain stores, supervising scribes, and occasionally instructing artisans. It's repetitive, slow, and oddly comforting to imagine a life of quiet competence that shaped an empire in subtle ways. And like many women tonight, her story gradually faded from the larger historical narrative, leaving only inscriptions and scattered artifacts as reminders of her steady hand. Finally, it's drift to Central Asia again, to the Mongol Empire, where Tregine Khatan, a regent of the 13th century, quietly ruled on behalf of her son. Tregine managed one of the largest empires in history, not by leading armies in person, but by delegating, overseeing governors, and maintaining administrative control. Her life was slow, methodical, and full of repetitive correspondence. Imagine mountains of letters, minor rebellions, inspections of distant provinces, and endless meetings with officials. There's a calming rhythm in this. Monotony, the quiet exertion of authority over one of the most vast and diverse empires the world has ever seen. And as usual, history mostly remembers her son for his campaigns, while her subtle management is tucked quietly into footnotes. So, as we drift gently through Ameniranus, Hatshepsut, Tuta, Rani Kanama, the Dahomey Amazons, Empress Suko, Vijayabai, Amenitor, and Tregine Khatan, notice the pattern. These women, often forgotten, spent decades quietly shaping their worlds. They managed empires, negotiated alliances, supervised bureaucracies, and oversaw rituals, not with loud explosions or dramatic battles, but with patience, endurance, and meticulous attention to detail. And there's something hypnotic about that. The steady rhythm of governance, the repeated routines, the small but lasting decisions. It's almost like a gentle lullaby, the quiet pulse of history. While kings fought, raided, and staged grand spectacles, these women quietly ensured that life went on, that states remained intact, and that culture persisted. They were not forgotten because they were unimportant. They were forgotten because subtlety rarely makes the history books. Alright, let's take a final, slow drift through the quiet echoes of history. By now, you've met Sobek Neferu in Egypt, Tamaris on the Central Asian steppes, Nzinga in Africa, Ilda in England, Tripuwana in Java, and Ya Asantua in Ghana, and many, many others along the way, each one quietly steering their people, their kingdoms, and sometimes entire empires, mostly without the fanfare or drama that textbooks love to highlight. And now, as we float gently toward the end of our journey tonight, it's worth pausing to reflect on what these lives teach us. These women ruled not with constant battles or loud proclamations, but with patience, quiet strategy, and slow, deliberate action. Their daily routines were long and repetitive. Council meetings, ceremonial duties, letters to read, reports to sign, minor rebellions to manage. But in that slow rhythm, they shaped the world. It's almost soothing to imagine it. Palace corridors bathed in soft sunlight, scrolls scattered on tables, advisors shuffling papers, incense burning quietly in the background, no clashing swords, no dramatic speeches, just governance, endurance, subtle influence, and the occasional tiny personal victory, a smile from a trusted advisor, a successful harvest, a dispute resolved without bloodshed. And perhaps the most gentle irony of all is that these women, forgotten or minimized in history, left legacies that outlived their names. Their influence seeped into generations, guided their descendants, and quietly shaped the cultures around them. The world moved on, as it always does, but the subtle traces of their leadership remain, like faint brushstrokes in a massive, sprawling mural that we are only beginning to notice. So tonight, as you settle in, your mind drift with them. Imagine Sobek Neferu adjusting her crocodile crown, Nzinga quietly strategizing while the sun sets over the African plains, Matilda sighing over endless letters, Wu Zishan reviewing another decree in her court, all of them patiently shaping their worlds, unseen and often uncelebrated. And in that slow, gentle reflection, maybe there's something comforting. Because the world is bigger than the loudest voices, power isn't always about swords or headlines. Sometimes, it's quiet, repetitive, patient, and enduring, just like the lives of these forgotten queens. And maybe, in remembering them tonight, we give them a small measure of the attention they deserved. In the calm, sleepy light of reflection. So, dim the lights a little more, take a slow breath, and drift along with the quiet pulse of history, carried gently by the hands of those women who once ruled the world, softly, steadily, and completely forgotten until now. Dear friend, if you haven't subscribed yet, just do it now, quietly, no pressure, and maybe tap that little like button while you're there. Anyway, no more waiting. Let's softly slip into tonight's story together. You wake up one morning in a medieval village. A rooster is screaming outside like it has unresolved emotional problems. The smell of wood smoke is already seeping through the air, and somewhere down the road, a woman steps out of a small timber cottage and ties her veil a little tighter. She's a widow, and that's going to define almost every part of her life from now on. Now, when we picture medieval widows, most people imagine an older woman, a grandmother type, gently stirring a pot of soup and giving unsolicited life advice. But no, most medieval widows were not old. Many were in their 20s or early 30s. Because medieval life had the same survival rate as a discount carnival ride. Husbands died from war, disease, farm accidents, infections, or simply refusing to stop drinking something called ale. That was basically bread-flavored bravery juice. So widows were often young, and they were suddenly standing at a crossroads. One path labeled poverty, another labeled remarriage, another labeled legal chaos, and a small, unexpected side path labeled surprisingly successful businesswoman. And the medieval world, being the medieval world, proceeded to do what it always did. Treat these women with a mix of suspicion, pity, and bureaucratic confusion. Let's float gently into their daily reality. When a husband died, the first question wasn't, "How is the poor widow feeling?" but rather, "So, who gets his stuff?" And yes, that's exactly the tone you should imagine. The legal system wasn't built to protect the widow emotionally. It was built to figure out where the goats and grain sacks were headed. And here's the twist: medieval widows actually had more rights than married women. Married women, legally, were basically decorative side tables with embroidery skills. A widow, though, she suddenly had something called legal personhood. She could sign contracts, appear in court, manage property, and occasionally tell men to stop bothering her. She could own land, run a shop, loan money, hire workers, and in some towns, even vote in local decisions. It's almost like the medieval world said, "You're a woman, so normally you don't get rights, but now that your husband's dead, someone has to pay taxes. So congratulations, here's a pen. Of course, it wasn't that simple. Rights varied by region, by social class, and by how pushy the male relatives were. But overall, widows had more freedom than wives, and many of them knew it, and held onto it, with the kind of determination usually reserved for guarding the last piece of bread in winter. Let's wander over to a small English town. Around the year 1300, the streets are muddy, the houses are leaning like they owe each other money, and everyone's business is everyone else's business. Here lives Anne, not a real Anne, but a very typical Anne. Her husband was a craftsman, maybe a shoemaker. When he died, the guild rules allowed Anne to keep running the shop at least for a while. Guilds had mixed feelings about widows. On the one hand, they needed someone to finish the orders so the customers didn't riot. On the other hand, letting women succeed too much made the guild masters nervous, because nothing terrifies insecure medieval men like a woman who knows the market value of leather. Anne, like many widows, kept her husband's workshop going. She knew how to manage the materials, deal with customers, handle payments, and because she'd been helping for years, she probably did half the work already. Many medieval women weren't allowed to be official apprentices, but unofficially, they learned everything. So now, as a widow, Anne runs the shop with calm authority. She hires an assistant, negotiates with traders, and probably sighs at least 10 times a day at the teenage boy who keeps losing his all. She earns her own income, controls her own budget, and doesn't have to ask anyone's permission to buy extra wool. And people notice. Some admire her, some are quietly jealous, some whisper, "Is she too independent?" Because medieval gossip had the range of a full-time news network. But Anne keeps going, because widows didn't have the luxury of falling apart, especially when they had children to feed. Let's drift a little further. Across Europe, widows had different levels of power and struggle. In Mediterranean towns like Florence or Venice, widows often became moneylenders. Not bank owners, that was for the elite, but small-scale lenders. The kind who kept a notebook in perfect handwriting and loaned out 5 or 10 florins at tiny interest rates. Why widows? Because they had fewer restrictions than wives, and because they were trusted to keep secrets, remember details, and not stab anyone over late payments. Imagine a widow sitting in a small quiet room, with a wooden chest beside her containing coins wrapped in cloth bundles. People knock softly at her door, maybe a fisherman who needs money to fix his boat, or a tailor who needs to buy cloth. She listens, nods, notes everything down, and gives out the loan. She isn't rich, she isn't glamorous, but she is stable. And in the medieval world, stability was the real luxury. These widow lenders became quietly essential to the economy. They funded small repairs, seasonal harvest needs, and merchant trips. They didn't appear in grand chronicles, because male historians didn't find paperwork glamorous. But without them, half the town would have been stuck repairing broken carts with hope and strength. Now, it's glide into the countryside where life was harder, slower, and far more dependent on the weather being in a good mood. A widow here often became what records call a cottager or landholder. Basically, I have a small house and hopefully some chickens. Her survival depended on how much land she had, whether her in-laws hated her, and whether she had grown sons to help. Rural widows worked constantly. They harvested grain, tended animals, carried firewood, spun thread, brewed ale, and tried to avoid dying of exhaustion. But they also had one advantage. No husband meant no one could legally confiscate their wages. Some widows even turned to brewing, not the fancy medieval alehouses run by large families, but small-scale household brewing. Women dominated alcohol production in many regions. Your average village had dozens of widows selling small ale, a low-alcohol drink that was safer than water and tasted like a loaf of bread dissolved in hopes and regrets. These women brewed in big, bubbling cauldrons, tested the foam with the seriousness of a medieval chemist, and sold their ale for small coins. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the roof repaired and the debts paid. Sometimes, a widow became famous for her ale, and nothing says medieval success like being known as that lady with the good brew down by the well. Let's keep walking softly into the social expectations. It's important to understand that medieval society expected widows to be sad, not because patriarchal Europe cared deeply about their emotional healing, but because people feared happy widows. Happy widows might choose not to remarry. Worse, they might start thinking for themselves. So widows were supposed to wear plain clothes, act humble, and avoid anything that looked like joy. There were sermons about it, lots of sermons. Medieval priests loved a sermon more than anything else, especially when it let them tell women what to do. But widows often ignored half those rules, because honestly, they didn't have time for it. Many widows quietly enjoyed the freedom of answering to no husband, no father, no brother. Some indulged in small luxuries, a nicer wool shawl, a better candle, a bit of cinnamon if they were feeling bold. Some even refused to remarry completely, choosing independence over starting the whole male control cycle again. And society didn't know how to handle that. A woman who answered to no man was, in medieval terms, basically a glitch in the system. Now, let's float into one of the more controversial topics: widows and remarriage. You might assume medieval widows remarried quickly. Many did. Survival often required it. A new husband meant financial stability, protection, and help with labor. But here's the sleepy twist: widows were some of the pickiest marriage candidates in Europe. Why? Because they actually knew what marriage was like. A never-married girl might walk into marriage with hope and optimism. A widow walked in with a quiet checklist. Does he have debt? Does he have annoying relatives? Does he snore like a dying donkey? Does he think emotional expression is a type of bird? Widows negotiated marriage contracts with shocking boldness. Some demanded rights to their own income. Others insisted on controlling their previous dowry. A few refused to live with their new husband's family. The medieval equivalent of setting healthy boundaries. Widows married late, married smarter, and married with more control. And if they didn't marry, they just carried on, running their businesses, raising children, and occasionally giving men that look that says, "No thank you, already been married once." Alright, let's pause the stroll for a moment. Take a breath. Let your mind rest. The medieval world is vast. But tonight, we're gliding gently through one small thread: the quiet, steady resilience of ordinary widows. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into their economic power, their legal battles, their unexpected influence, and the moments when widows became the backbone of entire towns. Hey again, if you're still awake, which honestly would surprise me in the best way, let's gently slide back into the quiet, steady world of medieval widows. We're not rushing, we're not building any suspense. We're just floating from one soft corner of history to another, like a documentary made out of warm tea and mild disappointment. So, let's keep walking. When a medieval husband died, the world around the widow didn't pause. The field still needed plowing, the bread still needed baking, and the rent still needed to be paid. With the enthusiasm of someone doing taxes during a thunderstorm, the legal system stepped in slowly, politely, and with all the efficiency of a horse on a muddy road. This brings us to one of the biggest parts of a widow's life: her inheritance. Now, you might imagine a nicely organized document with clean signatures. But medieval wills were often more like, "I leave my boots to Tom, my plow to my brother, and everything else, probably, to my wife." Unless someone argues. And someone always argued. Let's float into a small 14th century town court. Picture a wooden table, ink-stained parchment, a few candles flickering like they're exhausted, and 3 local officials who look like they've never said, "I understand," in their lives. A widow steps in. Her name could be anything: Margaret, Joan, Avice. Very medieval, very common, very practical. She's here because she wants what her husband promised her, and she's going to get it. Eventually, after everyone gives their extremely unhelpful opinions. You see, medieval inheritances had rules. Complex, contradictory, region-specific, rules that made perfect sense to no one except the guy who wrote them. Some areas gave widows dower rights, usually 1/3 of her husband's property, which she could use, but not always sell. In other places, widows got half. In others, she got nothing. Because the law said, please consult the male relatives, and asked politely. And yet, despite the chaos, widows learned how to navigate the system through persistence, through allies, through showing up so often that the court officials eventually just surrendered. Many widows fought for their rights in court, and they won more often than you'd expect. Because unlike many men, widows didn't have time for pride-based legal dramathons. They needed results, so they showed up with receipts. Literally, medieval receipts wrapped in waxed cloth proving what they were owed, and judges respected that, or they were too tired to argue anymore. Same result. Let's drift over to a city, maybe London, maybe Paris, maybe Bruges. Urban life gave widows challenges, but also chances. If a widow inherited her husband's business, a bakery, a tavern, a tailor's shop, a small shipping operation, she was often allowed to keep running it. Guilds weren't thrilled, but they tolerated widows because they were the human version of a temporary replacement part. Not glamorous, but necessary. Some guild rules literally said, a widow may continue her late husband's trade until she remarries, which is medieval legal speak for, you can be a businesswoman, but only if you remain single, thanks. Did widows follow that rule? Sometimes. Other times, they quietly hired a male worker, let him do the hands-on craft stuff, and she handled the money, the supplies, the customers, the contracts, the scheduling, and the entire business, while officially being just a widow keeping things going. One historian jokingly called them shadow bosses, which feels accurate. They weren't flashy, but they kept everything functioning. Imagine a widow running a bakery. She wakes early, lights the oven, kneads the dough, sprinkles flour with the calmness that only comes from surviving medieval life, and opens the doors as the sun rises. Children run for loaves. Merchants stop for bread wrapped in cloth. Travelers sniff the air like confused medieval bloodhounds and wander in. She builds a reputation slowly, steadily. Her bread is reliable. Her prices are fair. Her shop becomes a quiet pillar of the neighborhood. That's how widows gained influence. Not dramatic, not loud, just dependable. And in a world where half the population couldn't read, and the other half had questionable hygiene, being dependable was basically the medieval version of being a local celebrity. Let's drift a little deeper into money. Widows were often surprisingly good with finances. Not because medieval society trained them well, it absolutely did not, but because survival forced them into it. They tracked debts. They rented out rooms. They lent grain. They collected interest. They bargained in markets with the precision of someone who knows exactly how many onions she can afford. Some widows even became property investors, quietly buying small plots of land, renting them out, and living on the income. Not noble estates, not giant manors, just little strips of farmland and tiny cottages. Nothing fancy, but enough. In England, France, and the Low Countries, we see widows appearing as landlords in dusty town records. Some of them owned multiple properties, not because they were rich, but because property was the safest investment in a world where the bank was a guy named Roger with a wooden lockbox. Widows learned the system, and sometimes they manipulated it. Subtly, softly, sleepily, but effectively, like renting out land at slightly higher rates during harvest season, because they knew they could, or lending money in years when crops failed, because necessity makes borrowers very polite. Widows weren't villains, but they weren't fools. They simply did what they had to do. Now, let's wander over to something more emotional, because beneath the economic survival, there was grief. Real, heavy grief. But medieval widows didn't get much time to process it. Life demanded constant work. Food didn't cook itself. Clothes didn't mend themselves. Children didn't raise themselves. And the world didn't slow down just because someone was hurting. A widow might mourn for weeks, or months, or privately for years. But on the outside, she kept moving. Interestingly, some widows formed support circles with other widows, not official clubs. Medieval people didn't do clubs unless they involved ale or sword practice, but informal networks. Widows helped each other harvest crops when one was too ill to work. They shared tools. They lent each other small coins. They watched each other's children. These networks weren't written down, but they existed quietly, powerfully, and they kept countless families alive. Let's glide over to something slightly ironic. The church loved widows, not in a romantic way, more like, a woman without a husband. Excellent. Time to encourage her to become extremely holy. The church practically sprinted toward widows with messages like, you should stay unmarried, and pure, and humble, and probably donate something. Some widows did embrace the religious life. They lived quietly, they prayed, they gave charity, they joined small religious communities, not nuns, but groups of laywomen dedicated to good works. For them, it was peace, a new identity, a safe path. For others, it was a polite suggestion they ignored completely, because many widows valued independence more than piety, and staying single wasn't always realistic when rent existed. So the church preached, and widows nodded politely, then went home and made practical life decisions. Now, let's float toward a more unexpected part of widowhood. Some widows gained actual political influence, not at the royal level, but at the town level. In several medieval towns, especially in the Low Countries, widows with property could vote in local council elections. Imagine a medieval voting booth, a wooden bench, several sheets of parchment, and a clerk who looks like he hasn't smiled since the plague. Widows showed up, quiet, serious, focused. They voted because local decisions affected everything. Taxes, land rights, market rules, trade routes. Some towns even had widow-elected officials in charge of charity funds or guild disputes. It wasn't glamorous power, but it was real power, and male chroniclers naturally did not bother writing about it. Why record something historical when you can write yet another page about warfare, or how King so-and-so rode a horse? But the evidence is there. Widows didn't just survive medieval society. They shaped it. Softly, steadily, without ceremony. Let's drift into one last topic for part 2. Something very human. How widows were seen by their communities. The medieval world had stereotypes. Oh boy, did it have stereotypes. Widows were sometimes pitied, sometimes respected, sometimes seen as burdens, and occasionally, because medieval people were dramatic, seen as dangerously independent women who needed guidance, which is medieval code for, please marry again, so we understand what to do with you. But many widows carved out quiet reputations as dependable neighbors, skilled workers, reliable lenders, disciplined managers, community anchors, women who kept everything running when everything else fell apart. Not glamorous, not celebrated, but essential. Widows are the silent infrastructure of medieval society, the beams holding up the whole house, while everyone else argued about politics and plagues, and most of them never made it into the history books. But tonight, we're giving them their own soft spotlight. Alright, that's enough drifting for now. When you're ready, we'll glide into part 3, where we'll explore widow survival strategies, remarriage negotiations, what happened when widows got wealthy, and the surprising ways widows avoided exploitation. Part 3, the final drift: quiet strength, soft victories, and a gentle ending. So, let's take one last slow walk through the world of the medieval widow. We've wandered through their daily work, their money struggles, their quiet victories, their unexpected freedoms, their small networks of survival, and all the soft, invisible ways they held up towns, markets, and entire households. Widows were not the dramatic figures of medieval chronicles. They didn't sit on thrones. They didn't lead armies. They didn't appear in fancy manuscripts with gold halos and perfect posture, but they lived real, steady, stubborn lives. They worked until their hands hurt. They spoke softly in courtrooms. They kept shops running. They kept children fed. They kept communities stable, and slowly, gently, they created their own space in a world that never intended to give them one. Let's drift toward the end of their story. Most widows didn't become rich. Most didn't become powerful. Most didn't leave grand legacies carved into stone. But if you look closely at town records, market logs, guild notes, church accounts, you'll find them everywhere. Jane, who paid her taxes exactly on time for 15 years. Margaret, who rented out 2 small cottages and made just enough to stay independent. Isolde, who ran her husband's workshop until old age. Anne, who brewed ale so good the whole neighborhood remembered her for decades. Bridget, who raised 5 children alone and lived long enough to see them all married. Eleanor, who loaned money to half her street and kept the local economy quietly breathing. None of them made headlines, but without them, medieval life would have collapsed in on itself like a badly baked loaf of bread. Widows were the calm center of the storm, the steady heartbeat in fragile communities, the people who kept going even when the world didn't offer them a gentle path. And so, as we close this slow, sleepy wander through their hidden world, let's imagine one last scene. A small medieval house. A wooden door. A warm, dim candle glowing on a table worn smooth by years of use. A widow sits there, maybe spinning wool, maybe writing in a tiny account book, maybe sipping a cup of small ale she brewed herself. She's tired, but steady, weathered, but strong in the quiet way only experience can shape. Outside, the village settles under the night sky. The streets fade into silence. The fire crackles softly, and she goes on as she always has, shaping ordinary days with resilience nobody sings about, but everyone relies on. That's the true story of medieval widows. Not queens, not legends, just real women who carried more than history bothered to remember. And that's where we end tonight. Thank you for drifting through this quiet corner of the past. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. If your mind is calm, let it rest. And whenever you need another slow journey through forgotten history, I'll be here. Good night. Don't forget, like and subscribe.